We'll just start over here and we'll just kind of review a bit. Key in here. Again, on the KansasNebraska Act in 1854, Senator Stephen Douglas wanted federal support for building a transcontinental railroad west from Chicago. And to achieve this goal, he sponsored a bill through Congress known as the KansasNebraska Act. And the first part of that compromise, or excuse me, that act was going to be to repeal the Missouri Compromise of 1820 because both Kansas and Nebraska were north of the 36th parallel, which meant there could not be slavery there. So you can kind of see what's going to happen here. The second part of the KansasNebraska Act is they were going to create two new organized territories in the West. Not states, territories, Kansas and Nebraska. So Stephen Douglas takes the KansasNebraska Act to Congress and asks them to repeal the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which would eliminate prohibiting slavery in both the new Kansas and Nebraska territories in the West, which was the second part of the act. Now, the KansasNebraska Act had no problem passing through Congress. It abolished the Missouri Compromise, and it created the territories of Kansas and Nebraska. Now think about Stephen Douglas's philosophy when we talked about what to do with the lands acquired from Mexico. What did he think we ought to do concerning the issue of slavery? Popular sovereignty, let the people decide. This is going to be the same thing here. Once the KansasNebraska Act was passed, the territories of Nebraska and the territory of Kansas were going to be left to decide the issue of slavery themselves. That's why the Missouri Compromise of 1820 had to be repealed, because he wanted popular sovereignty to decide the slavery issue in the new territories of Kansas and Nebraska. Now, soon after the KansasNebraska Act passed, many pioneers and land speculators from both the North and the South rushed into this new territory. So as soon as it was open and established, pioneers that were tired of living east of the Mississippi moved west. Land speculators, those are people that suck up land and then sell it for a profit, right? We've talked about that before. They swarmed into those territories as well. So people took advantage of the KansasNebraska Act and moved in those areas. Now, it's kind of a first come, first served deal. So the competition for the best land, the promising sites for new towns, and the issue of slavery in those two territories is going to again lead to some bitter disputes. Because it's kind of in a way of free-for-all. Let's get out there and get the best land. Let's get out there and get the best town sites, okay, where we can build a new town. Let's get out there and populate those territories so we can decide whether they're going to be free or slave. It was a little bit of a free-for-all, and it led to some disputes. We'll talk about the territory of Kansas first. It especially caused problems in Kansas when it came time, because once you establish a territory, what do you have to organize in that territory? A government. And probably a constitution, because these are not states. And each state has their own constitution. Now we have a national constitution, but what they're going to do is they're going to get into these territories and they're going to form governments and constitutions. Well, we had some trouble in Kansas, because when everybody got to Kansas, what was the big question? Are we going to be a slave state or slave territory or free territory? So that was the crucial question in Kansas. Well, by the end of 1855, because of the split feelings by the people who settled there over the issue of slavery, the territory actually had two different constitutions. One for slavery and one against. So Kansas was really a hotbed of these disputes. Again, the territory of Kansas especially caused issue when the time came to draw up a constitution and organize a new territorial government. The crucial question among the people that swarmed in there, disorganized, was, are we going to be free or slave territory? And it got so controversial, and the people that lived there were so split in their feelings that they actually developed two constitutions within the territory, one free, one slave. Can you imagine that? That doesn't work very good. As a result of that controversy and that dispute, it takes us to our next subtopic, which is Bleeding Kansas. Bleeding Kansas. Well, picture this in your mind. Who's going to have to maybe try to solve this dilemma in the Kansas Territory? They can't have two constitutions. Who's going to have to fix that? Congress. Well, yeah, good guess. Congress is. Well, before they could really get organized and try to do that, violence broke out within the territory, and people referred to it as Bleeding Kansas. So before Congress could step in and try to straighten out this double constitution controversy, violence broke out between who? Pro-slavery people and anti-slavery people. They began to have conflicts, and violence broke out, which led to the term Bleeding Kansas. Now, I'll give you some examples. You got to remember that both Northerners and Southerners just rushed into that Kansas Territory. I said it was kind of a first-come, first-served deal. And because of that, violence erupted. I'll give you an example. First example, an armed pro-slavery group burned part of the town of Lawrence, Kansas, which was populated with what do you think? Anti-slavery settlers. So an armed pro-slavery group, in other words, a group or a mob that supported slavery, went into Lawrence, Kansas, which was inhabited by anti-slavery citizens, and burnt Lawrence partially to the ground. Okay, that was one example of violence. Now the next one is going to lead into some events that go towards the Civil War, and we'll talk about it. Maybe you know some of this. Well, you think that those anti-slavery people in Kansas are very happy about that? No, they sought revenge. And what happened is a fanatical white abolitionist, which means they abolish or would like to see the abolishment of slavery, a frantic white abolitionist by the name of John Brown gathered an armed group, including his own sons, and murdered 5 unarmed pro-slavery men. So in revenge for burning down Lawrence, Kansas on the part of pro-slavery people, a fanatical white abolitionist by the name of John Brown gathered together an armed group of men, including his own sons, and went and murdered 5 pro-slavery men.
On the blue and the gray, isn't the kid going to watch the head?
Try, but not for that.
For the trial.
Not for that event, because it's a great point. If you watch the blue and the gray, and we're going to watch it, and Mason has a great point. He does, in the movie, go watch the trial of John Brown. But it's not for that, it's for what he does later. And we're going to get to him later. Okay, but that's a good point.
Oh,
yeah, it's what he does later. Okay? Now, this is kind of interesting. I got a little, this is kind of more 70s stuff, but so maybe your grandparents at this age would get this. But anybody ever heard of the rock group Kansas? Carry on my wayward son. You heard that?
Yeah.
Hey, look at their album. Hey, look at their album cover. Who's on the cover of their album?
John Brown.
John Brown. Huh? How about that? I've been waiting a year to show that. There's a picture of John Brown on the cover of the Kansas album.
Can we listen to it?
Well, I don't have a record
Watch an
player.
episode of Super Nine.
But you've heard that song, haven't you? Carry on my wayward son? Yeah.
Yeah.
I do at home. Yeah, I have an 8-track too.
So you have your house at the bar?
We'll take it up and listen to it while we go. Anyway, isn't that ironic? That's what the musical group Kansas chose to have as the cover of their album, was a picture of the white abolitionist John Brown on the front of the album. Pretty cool. I thought it was kind of cool. Anyway, there it is. Okay, now, back to the lecture. Now, during this fighting over slavery versus not having slavery in Kansas, I just gave you 2 examples. This continued and continued and continued, and as a result of the violence in Kansas, more than 200 men and women were killed in this conflict before federal troops had to come into the territory and restore order. So I just gave you a couple of examples of violence, but there was so much violence going on over the issue of slavery in Kansas that led to the name Bleeding Kansas. They said that over 200 men and women were killed during this conflict in Kansas before federal troops had to be sent in to restore order. Thus the name Bleeding Kansas. That'll take us to our next subtopic, which is the election of 1856. This is kind of interesting. We're going to get back to politics as maybe we see it today. Well, listen to this. Prior to this election, another, quote, new political party formed. What do we have right now? The Democrats and the Whigs. Okay, the Whig party's starting to fade. And so it doesn't really even become a part of this too much. Okay? But a new political party comes in. A new one. What do you think it was? The Republicans made a comeback. Followers of Thomas Jefferson's philosophy, that he was already long gone, but followers of his philosophy reestablished the Republican Party in American politics. So in this election of 1856, you're going to have the Republican versus the Democrats, and the Whigs are out of the picture. Okay? Republicans versus Democrats. The old Republican Party has made a comeback. Now, the Democratic Party, they were big supporters of the Compromise of 1850. They were big supporters of the KansasNebraska Act. And they nominated James Buchanan of Pennsylvania for the presidency. So the Democratic Party, who were big supporters of the Compromise of 1850, were big supporters of the KansasNebraska Act. They nominated James Buchanan of Pennsylvania for the presidency. James Buchanan. The Republicans countered with a familiar name, John C. Fremont. And they ran a little bit different campaign slogan because somebody in here didn't like the last one. Was that Nielsen over here that was talking about that? Who was talking about the conflict of the last? Well, that was Lori. That was Lori. Sorry, Taylor. Sorry. Lori didn't like the last one. She thought it was contradictory, right? Yeah. Well, here's the new Republican. Yeah. Okay, let's try this one. This was the new one. New one for the Republicans. Free soil, free speech, free men, and free... Who's running? Fremont. There you go. Free soil, free speech, free men, and Fremont.
Wait, so is Fremont with two E's?
No, just
How do you
one.
spell Fremont?
F-R-E-M-O-N-T.
Okay.
So the Republicans countered by nominating John C. Fremont for the presidency, and they ran under the campaign slogan of free soil, free speech, free men, and Fremont. Yeah. Well, Buchanan wins the election. He has 174 electoral votes compared to 114 for Fremont, and assumes the presidency right here. Where are we at?
Do we need to know those numbers?
Right here, James Buchanan.
Do we need to know those numbers?
Yeah, 174 to 114. 174 to 114. And James Buchanan of Pennsylvania becomes the nation's 15th president.
What happened to the other people?
What? Am I missing something?
What happened to the two behind him?
Zachary Taylor, what was he?
He was the one that nobody passed.
We count wrong?
No, we went.
I'm pretty sure that's Franklin.
I'll do it.
13, 14, 15.
Who's 13?
Yeah, who's those two?
What about Franklin Pierce?
Who's this
The
guy?
next one.
Who's this guy?
What about Franklin Pierce?
Who is this guy?
Franklin Pierce.
Why, who's talking about Pierce?
Whoa.
Uh-oh. We skipped those up.
Have I skipped something here? What's the last election before this?
The last one was with Taylor.
52.
Oh, I skipped some elections.
Why?
Yeah, we skipped 52.
Yeah, we
Why
don't.
though?
Okay.
Moving on.
I was so we can't.
All right. Now, Who is that guy?
Here.
Who is
Well,
this?
who cares?
He's obviously not.
Taylor? This is Franklin Pierce. Who's that?
Franklin.
No, wait.
Millard Fillmore. Yeah, very good.
Why?
Millard Fillmore. Why did I skip? Why did I skip him?
Because they just.
Because what was going on during the
Why
time?
do we not
The
do
issue
more?
of slavery. Okay. Moving on. The Dred Scott decision. Let's get going here. Dred Scott decision. You're going to have a little assignment on this, so you might want to pay attention. We're at the Dred Scott decision. I skipped a couple. Hey, just because it's your birthday doesn't mean you get to run the show. All right. This is a very important decision here. On March 6th, 1857. March 6th, 1857. The Supreme Court of the United States handed down the Dred Scott decision. And this is a good chance this could be on the AP exam. On March 6, 1857, the Supreme Court handed down what was known as the Dred Scott decision. Anybody know who Dred Scott was in history? He was a slave who appealed all the way to the Supreme Court for his freedom. Dred Scott was a slave who appealed all the way to the Supreme Court for his freedom. Now, what would be his argument, do you think? Why would all of a sudden this guy think he should be free? That's a good guess. That's a very good guess, but not quite. He argued that because his owner took him from a slave state, Missouri, and moved to a free state, the Wisconsin Territory, at the time, that he should be free because the Wisconsin Territory was a free state. So Scott's argument was that he should be a free man because his owner had taken him from a slave state in Missouri and moved him to a free territory, the Wisconsin Territory. How did it end up in the Supreme Court? Did he just say, I'm going to go to the Supreme Court? No, he had to go through the chain of command. He actually, a lower court ruled in his favor. And you think that'd be over, but why wasn't it over?
His owner's probably.
Because the other side appealed it to the next court, which ruled against him. So as a virtue, he then appealed to the ultimate court, which makes the final decision, no more appeals, and that was the Supreme Court. So he appealed his case to the lower court and won. Then that was appealed, that decision was appealed to another court in which he was ruled against. And as a result of that, he took his case to the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court decision is final. Okay? Well, the Supreme Court ruled that a residence in either a free territory or a free state was not enough to give Dred Scott his freedom. The Supreme Court ruled that a residence in a free territory or a free state had not given him the right to freedom. That's what their ruling was. Now, there's got to be a reason they ruled that. Think about it. Who's the only person that can appeal to the Supreme Court? This is part of the ruling. What do you have to be appealing to the Supreme Court? You've got to be a citizen. Okay? The Supreme Court ruled that he did not even have the right to appeal the decision to the Supreme Court because he can't sue in either state or federal court because he's what, according to the Supreme Court? Not a citizen. So this decision by the Supreme Court, the Dred Scott decision, basically meant that all slaves that lived in the United States were not what of the United States? Citizens. And as a result of the fact they weren't citizens, they didn't have the right to sue in either state or federal court. Either one. So I want to go through this Dred Scott decision again for you because I want you to understand this because I really do believe this is a possibility on your exam. On March 6, 1857, the Supreme Court handed down the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott was a slave who appealed to the Supreme Court for his freedom. Scott's argument was that he should be a free man because his owner had taken him from a slave state, Missouri, to a free territory, the Wisconsin Territory. Because one lower court decided for Scott and another ruled against him, the case ended up in the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled that residents in a free territory and or free state had not given Dred Scott his right to freedom. That decision by the Supreme Court meant that all slaves living in the United States were not citizens of the United States. And as a result, Dred Scott, being a slave and black and not a citizen, did not have the right to sue in either state or federal court. That is a big decision. Now, I'm going to put some trust in you guys. Here's the sign. I do not trust easily, so when I tell you I trust you, please don't make me regret it. I trust you. I have a parental meeting in about 2 minutes that I had to schedule for this lady. I am going to give you your assignment. This is a reading assignment. It tells you about the Dred Scott decision, and it asks you to explain the Supreme Court Justice, a guy by the name of Roger Taney. It's no longer John Marshall. Roger Taney is the Supreme Court Justice, and they're going to ask you to give reasons why he decided like he did, and what founding documents do we have in our country that he used as evidence in his decision. What could they possibly be? Founding documents. Constitution, Declaration of Independence. Okay, you can use the notes I gave you too. I'm going to give you the rest of the period to work on these. If you happen to get done, you can put them in the basket there. If you do not get done, they will be due at the start of the period tomorrow. Okay?